Hello, and welcome to Formative Assessment, research-based classroom practice. I'm glad you could join us. I'm Terry Shiverdecker, Science Content Specialist for the Ohio Resource Center. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the Submit a Question button. You have the opportunity to join our discussion by submitting your question about today's topic. Do so early, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the live program. You'll also find support materials related to today's topic, including the feature article and companion mini collections. These materials can be accessed at any point during the webcast and will continue to be available on the Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT homepage. Now I'd like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Karen Irving, an Assistant Professor of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at The Ohio State University, and Heather Webker, a science teacher at St. Mary's Memorial High School. Welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Let's begin by clarifying what we mean by formative assessment.
So assessment is a critical link in teaching and learning. Teachers are really familiar with the idea of summative assessment, which generally takes the form of tests and quizzes and occurs at the completion of a teaching unit. Formative assessment occurs more in an ongoing manner as the instruction is unfolding. Over the last 10 to 20 years, a significant research base is developed that helps us understand the naive conceptions that students bring with them when they come into the classroom. Previously, I think teachers thought that students arrived as a blank slate without any understanding of the science topics that were going to be discussed that day. But it turns out that kids come in with a wild variety of understandings about the natural world. And these understandings sometimes block their learning progress in the science content that's going to be presented. Formative assessment is a process that teachers can use to help learn about what the students already know when they get to class, and that they can use to help them guide their instructional strategies for a successful lesson.
Heather, what would you like to add?
As a classroom teacher, formative assessment involves a series of checks to continually check for your students' understandings of the concepts that you're trying to get across to them. While it might focus on drawing out those naive conceptions that they hold and seeking to modify them and begin the process of learning, it might also involve checking to see where your students' background knowledge lies, whether it's from their personal backgrounds or from their previous science class experience. For instance, in the chemistry classroom, I have an entirely different meaning of nucleus than what my students have learned in the biology classroom the year before. So it's drawing out those ideas and making sure that your students are all on the same page. It also involves, in science education, a particular emphasis on their math skills, because those play such an important role in many of the lessons.
That's a good point about not knowing what they come to us with, not only in our own discipline, but from other disciplines. Karen, what more can you tell us about formative assessment?
In this age of high-stakes tests and summative assessments where teachers are particularly focused on student achievement, it's helpful to know that there has been a wide amount of research done on the formative assessment practice and a strong correlation between the practice of formative assessment in the classroom and student gains in achievement. The other thing that I think is interesting about formative assessment is that this is a skill that can be practiced and learned over time. So novice teachers develop their skills with formative assessment slowly as they learn about their particular students, as they learn about their content area, and as they develop their pedagogical content knowledge.
You know, I love that, building skills over time, because as teachers, we are also always learners. So we're building these skills and learning about our students as we go. Karen, in the article, you talked about a framework for formative assessment practice. Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Okay, in order to make formative assessment easier to understand for teachers, researchers have broken it down into some steps that I think teachers will identify with, because they parallel the kinds of practice that we're used to performing in the classroom. The first thing that teachers do when they think about a lesson is to figure out what their learning objective for that day's lesson might be. What do I want students to know and be able to do at the completion of this instructional sequence? Once you have the objective in mind, the next part of the planning process involves selecting a task. A rich task that allows opportunity for formative assessment might be an inquiry type task, or a task that encourages discourse in the classroom where students talk to each other and students talk to teachers. In more traditional classrooms where the teacher stands in front of the room and lectures to the students, the opportunities for formative assessment are quite restricted because there's no opportunity for the teacher to figure out whether the kids are actually learning anything during that instructional sequence.
As part of this setting the learning task and the learning objectives, you as a teacher need to decide on the quality criteria that need to be determined. You need to decide what your students need to know and at what level they need to be able to demonstrate their understanding. What do they need to be able to do? As a classroom teacher, you realize that sometimes this becomes negotiable. Sometimes with your students, you can discuss items such as how much of this will be on the test. Will I be able to use a calculator? Will a periodic table be available? And these are items that you can discuss and develop a conversation around and decide together as a learning community. There are, of course, some items that are non-negotiable. For instance, anything related to safety in the science classroom is a non-negotiated item. You as the teacher are the expert and you need to set those standards.
Okay, that negotiating with students, that's really a powerful thing, and it really empowers students and helps them to take some ownership of their learning. I enjoyed doing that when I was in the classroom, and I love seeing teachers doing it today. But you make a good point about the safety being a non-negotiable item, something we're always concerned about in the science classroom. So Karen, what's the next step in the framework for formative assessment?
Formative assessment is an ongoing practice that occurs as the lesson unfolds. So once the teacher has identified the learning objective and selected a rich task for students to engage in, the teacher gathers data about how that task is unfolding. Teachers are familiar with this. This is the part where you look at your students and you try to figure out if they're doing what you've asked them to do or whether they don't understand the instructions that you have given them for the day. It's not a formal practice of assigning grades or identifying right or wrong so much as it's an informal observation, close observation of how the lesson unfolds in the classroom.
Heather, what would you like to add?
I think you need to remember while you're gathering this data that there's some data that's very easy to gather, and these are the visible cues: students' body language and students' attitudes and students' behavior. And these type of pieces of data are very important to the classroom learning environment because a well-organized, structured learning environment is crucial, but behavior data doesn't really give you the information you need to know about what your students know. So you also need to learn how to ask the right questions and listen for the right answers that your students are giving to know whether or not they actually understand the learning tasks and the learning objectives that you're giving them. You need to develop discourse in your classroom, and it needs to be an ongoing, continual thing. It needs to be an everyday situation in your classroom where you learn to ask the right questions and you learn to listen to what your students are saying to evaluate whether or not they actually know.
Yeah, and it does come back, it always comes down to the learning. Are they learning what we want them to learn? Not only are they well behaved, but are they also learning something? So we first identify the task, and then we gather data on what the students are learning. What's the next step in the process?
In addition to gathering data, and often almost simultaneously with the gathering data process, teachers are evaluating that data. So you figure out how the lesson is going. Are the students able to understand the instructions that you've given them? Are they able to complete the task? And you're evaluating that, yes, the lesson is going really well, we can move forward, or perhaps they already learned this last year, and so the lesson that you have planned doesn't really need the kind of depth that you had intended for that lesson. So that evaluation step is an ongoing step, and it's very much related to what science educator folk call pedagogical content knowledge. The idea of knowing how to teach and knowing how to teach a particular content area. So knowledge of that content and the best way to teach that content in your classroom.
Heather.
As you're evaluating this data, it becomes very important for you to develop some on-the-fly thinking skills. When a situation arises that you were not expecting, you need to do your best to instantly change direction and lead the students where you need to go. This comes with experience, definitely, but even as a novice teacher, there are things that you pick up on very quickly. If something goes poorly in your morning class, you're going to change the way that it goes in your afternoon class. If a question came up in the morning class, you know that that would be a good question to pose to your afternoon class. And decisions like that can be made. This is where also the misconception research becomes very important. If you go into the lesson knowing what misconceptions students are likely to hold, then you can plan accordingly, and you can have some questions prepared and ready to ask the students to see if those naive conceptions indeed do exist.
Okay, good. And you talked about the questioning and the teachers' questioning skills, how powerful that is. That's a good place too to check on through questioning whether students are understanding that scientific terminology, whether they're using it effectively and appropriately. Those questioning skills, just the importance of those just can't be underplayed. So Karen, we've identified the task, we've gathered data, we've evaluated the data. What's the final step in this formative framework for formative assessment?
So in the final step in the framework is actually the part that distinguishes formative assessment from summative assessment. In a summative assessment process, once you've completed the evaluation, you write the grade in the book and you move on to the next chapter. In formative assessment, the evaluation is not the last step. It's the step that helps the teacher make decisions about how instruction should proceed in that classroom. So this is also occurring almost at the same time as the gathering data and the evaluation of that data, that on your feet thinking, the lesson's going well, I'll go ahead and assign the homework problems that I had planned for today. Or, oh my goodness, the lesson's not going so well. I perceive that the students really need to practice something that I didn't include in my plans for today, and so maybe I want to modify the homework instructions or the homework plans that I had. We have in our minds how the lesson's going to go before we instruct it, and sometimes students' ideas about that based on their naive conceptions that they bring with them to the classroom make that lesson unfold in a way that's quite different from what we initially had planned.
So with this, with the formative assessment, this is not about gathering grades at this point.
No, this is not about grades at all. This is about learning about student learning during the instructional process so that you can tailor your instruction to the specific students that you have in your classroom during that instructional period. Okay. That might be different first period and third period or sixth period depending on the particular students that you have in that group.
Okay, good. Heather, just a little bit earlier, you talked about being familiar with that research on misconceptions so that we know ahead of time and can anticipate what our students may not know, and the importance of planning questions that you will ask during the lesson. So can you explain to us what's the difference between planned formative assessment and unplanned formative assessment?
Planned formative assessment is that plan that you have in mind going into the lesson, knowing what your learning objectives are, and knowing what you need to know about your students' learning before, during, and after the lesson. You go into the lesson knowing that there are certain questions that you're going to ask at certain times in the lesson as checkpoints. You go into the lesson with certain problems that you know you're going to have the students solve to demonstrate whether or not they know the learning objectives. You do planned assessment knowing that when you get into the lesson, you're going to have to assess where the students are and you're going to have a plan to do that. Unfortunately, things don't always go as we plan, so unplanned formative assessment becomes just as important. And this is where you have to use that on-the-fly data that you're gathering through your planned formative assessment and through your questioning skills and through your discourse, and switch gears. If you get into the lesson and learn that the students can't do some basic skill that you planned on them being able to do, you need to start there. You can't go on and with your learning lesson, your learning task, if they don't know how to do the very basics, because nothing's going to be accomplished then. So unplanned formative assessment involves listening and making sure that you are asking the right questions and checking for the student learning when something unplanned comes up.
Yeah, by way of example, and it's from my own experience, oftentimes ninth graders in physical science, you'd be ready to work on some graphing skills with them, and you think, okay, we're ready to go. I'm going to have them do a velocity time graph, and you get into it, and you realize, their graphing skills are not where I thought they were going to be. We're going to switch gears here now, and rather than having them create a velocity time graph, I'm going to work with them on how to do graphing to begin with. So the unplanned really plays an important role in this formative assessment piece. Karen, what would you like to add to that?
I think that when we talk about unplanned formative assessment, it almost sounds like it wouldn't always happen. Whereas planned formative assessment might be assessment that would always be incorporated in a lesson. But I think that formative assessment, and unplanned in particular, is an ongoing kind of assessment that occurs every day in every lesson. And so that's where the practice component of the formative assessment can be helpful for teachers in terms of developing their skill. The teachable moment that occurs when you realize that a student has a different idea about the lesson than the one that you had in mind when you're presenting that lesson. That is an example of a formative assessment experience that a teacher might have. Now, we don't always have these great aha moments in every lesson that we teach, but each day when we teach and interact with students, we are closely observing and are in tune with those students and making sense out of their response to the lesson so that we can better guide our own instructional decision making to enrich the learning experience.
So we'll always have to be on the lookout for that teachable moment. Okay, great. What are some strategies that you might use to collect formative assessment data?
Probably the most common planned formative assessment approach is the pre- and post-test approach. And sometimes this is just at the beginning of the class period and the end of the class period. And the more summative form would be at the beginning of the instructional unit and in the end of that instructional unit. There are ways, however, of doing unplanned formative assessment in the middle of a lesson using handheld technology devices that give teachers the opportunity to pose a question and to get an instant response from a large number of students in the classroom in a very short period of time. This can create teachable moments in the classroom that were not planned, that respond to the way a particular lesson is unfolding.
Okay, Karen, you talked about the clickers and those handheld devices as being an excellent way to collect formative assessment data. We know that those are not always available. So, Heather, can you talk to us about some non-technology techniques that we could use to collect formative assessment data?
Definitely, and I think all classroom teachers probably have a huge amount of these ideas of non-tech, but my favorite is the whiteboarding concept, where each student or each group of students has an individual small whiteboard that they can use to do a huge variety of things. You can use this as a very visual way for students to show their work and show what their understanding is of a concept at a certain point in time. An example is, for instance, if you're studying gases, you can ask them to draw a particle diagram of what's happening when a gas expands. This is a way to see if they actually understand what's happening at the particle level. It's a way to draw out any possible naive conceptions they have, possibly about the particle size, whether it's the actual particles that are expanding or the distance between them. You can draw in what is in between the particles. There's just so many things you can do with it. And this is a very quick, easy way to check what your students know at a certain point in time. You can check the whole class at once. You can have each student draw a diagram and look at them all at once. You can have a group of students do it. It's a way to draw in shy learners who normally wouldn't volunteer answers. They feel a lot more comfortable working with a partner or two, and they're going to develop a discourse amongst themselves that are going to lead to some great teachable moments as well. If you're looking for more individual data, journaling is a great way. You can do the same things that you would do on the whiteboard in a journal situation. This does take a little bit more teacher time because you need to then read their journals individually and provide individual feedback, but that's just as important. There are a multitude of other ideas. Exit slips, where you have the students write down 2 things they learned and 1 question they have, and you can bring those home with you and plan accordingly for the next day.
Okay. It may be helpful to look at how some of these strategies can be incorporated into a lesson. Let's go to the ORC website and look at the chemistry of hair care. This is ORC number 3580. We're going to start off with the ORC record for this lesson. This, of course, is where you can find information about the lesson, including the alignment to the Science Academic Content Standards. Now let's go to the lesson. This is a promising practice lesson from ScienceNet Links that could follow introductory instruction on acids and bases. The lesson begins with a class conversation that links the real-world topic of hair care to acids and bases. The teacher follows this with a series of questions about acids and bases that helps assess students' prior knowledge. Students then determine the pH of several different shampoos, test hair samples, and learn more about the chemistry of hair care through an online exploration. Students demonstrate what they have learned when they create an advertisement for a shampoo in which the chemistry of the shampoo is explained. This is a great lesson that uses a real-world context, an inquiry investigation. It effectively integrates technology and has a creative summative assessment. One of the things we found at ORC is that formative assessment strategies are often missing from even the best lessons. There are several places where formative assessment strategies could be incorporated into this lesson. We're going to focus on assessing prior knowledge and science process skills. What formative assessment strategies would you add to this lesson? Heather?
Some planned formative assessment activities that I would have going into this, first of all, to assess their prior learning, I might ask them to draw particle diagrams of an acid solution, a base solution, and a neutral solution. That might be a starting activity for this particular lesson to see if they truly understand those concepts before you go on. There is a great list of questions within this lesson. What is pH? What are acids? What are bases? And so on. Those questions would be great starting points as well. You could either have individual students whiteboard them, groups of students whiteboard them, you could use them as journal questions, you could use them just as classroom discussion items. So there's a great amount of built-in planned formative assessment that you could use.
Okay, great. Karen, what would you like to add to this lesson?
I think that's important when you're thinking about an inquiry lesson of this nature, that you allow sufficient time for collection and analysis of the data that you have in mind. So again, with the whiteboarding technique, this can be very helpful. Students can either work in small groups and produce one response that you can review for everybody at one time. You can use a variety of other techniques, card responses, that are very active and engage many of the students in the class. With an inquiry lesson of this nature, you have the opportunity for student discourse, student-student discourse, and student-teacher discourse. A time-honored teaching technique is to listen to students, to have them speak in class in order for them to learn to use the language of that particular topic and to express themselves in scientifically acceptable ways.
Okay, great. We've talked now about formative assessment in kind of a general terms. We've looked at formative assessment within the context of a particular lesson. Let's think for a minute about how we can use released OGT items for formative assessment. What you see on your screen now is the stimulus for a released OGT item. Karen, can you read the question and then talk to us a little bit about how we might use this item for formative assessment?
Certainly. The text that goes along with this particular diagram reads, in the diagram below, similar types of waves with the same amplitude travel in the same medium. The diagram is then presented in the question, and below that, the students are asked, compared to wave X, which statement is correct? And they're given 4 possible responses. Wave Y has the greater speed. Wave Y has less energy. Wave Y has a lower frequency. Wave Y has a shorter wavelength. So a typical way that a question like this might be used for formative assessment as opposed to summative assessment would be as a bell ringer, where students might see this question on the overhead projector when they come into the classroom and they're asked to respond to that. In order to turn that from straight summative, where you're just looking to see that the correct answer here is answer selection D, the teacher might engage students in discussion of the vocabulary that are included in this question. For instance, do they know what a wave is? Do they understand the term amplitude? What does it mean to talk about a medium?
Let's talk for a minute about the vocabulary and the phrase medium, the word medium. Is that going to be a problem for kids?
I think that it is. I think when most young students hear the word medium, they think about their t-shirt size. It's not a small, it's not a large, it's a medium. And yet in physical science and physics and discussion of waves, when we use the term medium in a scientific way, has a totally different meaning for students. So this idea of engaging students in conversation, using scientific terms in accurate ways, is an important way for teachers to gather information about what students know. If the teacher discovered that students don't understand that word medium, then that needs to be an instructional point in the lesson for the day.
Okay. Heather, can you share some additional ways we might use this released OGT item as a formative assessment tool?
Sure. In addition to all the things that we've discussed so far, you as a teacher have a craft, you have an art, and you can do a lot with this particular item. You can use it as a bell ringer, you can use it as a pre-assessment, a post-assessment, all the traditional things you might do with it, but then you can also look at maybe just the diagram. Give kids just the diagram and ask them, tell me everything you can tell me about these two waves. You could have the kids themselves create questions and answers based off of the diagrams and have them share those with other groups. You could present just the answer choices and ask the kids to develop a diagram that would actually represent each of those answer choices. So there are many, many ways that you could implement this.
Okay, great. Well, talking about questions, we've received several questions from our viewers, and I'd like to share some of those with you and allow you to share your expertise with them as we continue this conversation. This is a good one, and I think it deals with time and managing our time in the classroom, and I think that's something that we all, certainly as classroom teachers and even now in our professional lives, struggle with. I have heard enough, let me start again. I have a hard enough time keeping up with grading and responding to student work now. Do you have any tips for managing the grading of formative assessment?
I think the important thing to remember about formative assessment is that it doesn't need to be graded. One of the distinctions between a formative assessment process and a summative assessment process is the fact that teachers don't assign grades. It's not that you're not gathering information and evaluating that information, but the purpose for the process is to inform both the students and the teachers about where they are in the learning process, and to help students and teachers figure out what they need to do next in order to advance their learning. So even without the grades, however, it is a time-consuming process to evaluate 30 student responses, and if you're teaching multiple sections, which high school teachers are, it's many more than 30 students over a day. This is one reason things like electronic response systems are very helpful, because they're very speedy. They also can collect information from most every student in the classroom, as opposed to just a few vocal students in the classroom. And they can aggregate that data quickly for students. They don't evaluate it, and they certainly don't tell the teacher what to do when they get those responses. But they do shorten and improve the first two steps, or actually the second and third step, the gathering data and evaluating data step of the formative assessment process.
Okay. Heather, do you have anything to add for that particular question?
I don't think so. I think that summed it up well.
Okay. Karen, you've offered us a perfect segue into this next question. There's no way my school can afford electronic clickers or individual whiteboards with markers. Do you have any other ideas for immediate feedback and data collection? I think that's a good one for you, Heather.
Okay. I think there's a lot of ideas that you can use. We're probably all familiar with the thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. You know, just asking your students quickly, do you agree with what I just said, disagree, or you're not sure? And you can quickly visually look around the room and see. You can make little construction paper cards that have A, B, C, and D on them and have them hold up what their answer is instead of collecting it through a clicker system. It does almost the same thing. Just developing those discourse and questioning skills is just another strategy as well. There's no gadgets to that. You just listen and learn how to listen.
Oh, listening is important. You know, we've talked a lot about questioning, but and you both have mentioned that. Listen to what the students are saying. There are cues in what they say that are huge tips to to how they're developing this knowledge. Anything to add for that question, Karen?
I have seen in some classrooms where teachers have taken the construction paper cards that Heather was talking about and created sets of them and then clipped them together and attached them physically to the students' seats. An advantage of this technique is that they're always there. Students don't put them in their book bags and take them away with them. If they're laminated, then it's difficult for students to write on them. So they can be used for a longer period of time, and they're readily available for teachers when they want students to, flash up whatever their particular answer might be to a question.
Okay. Here's one that I think follows nicely. How important is feedback in the formative assessment process?
I think feedback is critical. The research on feedback is mixed in terms of immediate feedback versus delayed feedback. For a very difficult task, for ordinary learners, immediate feedback has the edge. There are more research studies that show that it's important to provide that feedback to the students very quickly. For high achievers and more difficult tasks, it might be better to delay the feedback and allow the student to struggle a little bit longer before jumping in and providing them with their answers. So there is a lot of ongoing research on feedback. It's a really critical part of the formative assessment process. Probably the one complete statement I can make is that grades have been found to be particularly successful in terms of feedback. In many cases, the grades actually turn students off.
Wow.
When they get the grade, they don't pay any attention to why they got the grade. They're just happy with the grade. And so I think we've all had that experience of spending time writing comments on student papers, and they look at the grade and throw the paper in the trash, and all those comments are missed.
Yeah. Heather, what would you like to add to this?
Building on that, I would say whenever you can provide feedback, it is definitely a benefit to your students and their learning. And just from personal experience, students have made comments when I write notes on their tests or their essays or any form of assessment. They say, I really like that you write comments. It helps me understand better. Whatever it is, they understand it better. And so that's really rewarding to them and really helps their learning process. But at the same time, it's not always realistic to be able to provide feedback to your students. And I think it's important for teachers to realize that formative assessment is also about gathering data for the teacher to use. Mm-hmm. So it's not realistic or even necessary to always be providing the students with that feedback. Some of it is for your own planning purposes and to know whether or not the learning objectives have been met, what their prerequisite skill level is, and that kind of information. So it's not always a necessary part of the process.
Okay. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. And this one I find to be really interesting. This series of webcasts, of course, is focused on the OGT, so we're thinking about middle and high school students. But this question asks, are you going to be discussing middle/elementary activities? Is the formative assessment different for younger students? What are your thoughts on that? Just some cursory thinking on that.
I think the overall framework would remain the same. I think the learning objectives and the tasks would be tailored to the particular student. I think the misconceptions might be different as students age. So younger students might have different ideas about the world simply because they're less experienced about the world. There are ideas that older students may have been exposed to that younger students hadn't heard about yet that could be important for teachers to know about in order to better target their teaching episodes. But the overall idea, this idea of knowing what you're going to teach, finding a task that actually helps kids learn what it is you're trying to teach, and then observing closely and gathering data so that you, in time, to change your teaching to fit the students. I think that's going to be as true of the elementary classroom as it would be of a middle school or a high school classroom. Heather, what do you think about that?
I think that I would agree with what Karen says, that the overall process is going to be the same, very similar. Your questioning skills are still going to be very important, and your listening skills. But you may be, with younger learners, asking different types of questions, and certainly your vocabulary is going to be a lot different with those learners. You may have to ask more guided questions than what you do with older learners who come in with more ideas already. You may have to ask more specific questions with the younger learners to get out of them what you're trying to find out from them. But the overall framework is something that is useful for teachers of all levels.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you. That's all the questions we have time for now. I do have a couple others here, but that unfortunately that's all we have time for. I'd like for each of you to share some final points, some final thoughts about our topic of formative assessment that we've spent a little bit of time with today. Karen, final thoughts?
I think it's really important to remember that assessment is the essential link between teaching and learning, and that teachers engage in assessment every day, whether they think about it formally or not. The idea of formative assessment is to improve this ongoing practice of observing what's happening in the classroom and of thinking about where students are in their learning process in time to adjust instruction to support the learning of their students. I think it's also really important to keep in mind that there's a lot of research out there that demonstrates that improved practice in formative assessment has really positive results in terms of student learning. And since I know that's what all teachers want for their students, I encourage them to work on their formative assessment skills actively in the classroom.
Thank you. Heather, final thoughts?
I think as a classroom teacher, the word assessment itself is very scary and overwhelming because especially in Ohio, there's such an emphasis on assessment. And sadly, that's summative assessment and high-stake testing instead of what really the focus should be on, which is formative assessment. There's nothing really scary about that. And I'm glad that we've had this discussion today to kind of show the importance of constantly checking for student learning and using that learning and information in those assessment tools to help better your teaching, which in turn will improve your students' learning.
Okay, great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Heather, for participating in our program today.
Thank you. It's been our pleasure.
And thank you very much for your participation and email questions. In this webcast, we've clarified what we mean by formative assessment, discussed a framework for formative assessment, differentiated between planned and unplanned formative assessment, examined some specific strategies within the context of a lesson, and suggested some ways released OGT items can be used in formative assessment. Additional information is available in the supporting materials found on the Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT homepage at www.ohioRC.org/4/science/OGT. If you would like to learn more about these topics, please contact ORC at web@ohioRC.org. We would be happy to work collaboratively with you to plan building or district-wide professional development programs. For the Ohio Resource Center, I'm Terry Shiverdecker, wishing you success with all of your science instructional strategies.